My name is Doug Tepe. This is the Tinkering and Create class on 3D animation and modeling. I'm currently using a software called Blender. You can get it from blender.org or from the popular game streaming app called Steam as well. That's where I'm currently working it off of, is from the Steam installation. So we're going to be starting with this cube here. To check out the dimensions of my cube, make sure I have my screencast on here. There we go. So to check out the dimensions of my cube, I press the letter N, or I click on this little arrow in the upper corner here, and it'll give me the details of my cube. And it will say that it is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. All right, so just got to notice that we are good. Excellent. All right, so we have 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters here. I click on my object, my cube. I press the S key until I shrink it down till it's a size that is kind of a typical size for a chair. Looking at the chair that I'm sitting on right now, this looks to be about a, I don't know, 3/4 of a meter wide. All right, so now my cube is 3/4 of a meter wide. Now let's say I want to then shrink it down so that it is flat. Again, I can press the S key. There we go. And with the S key, I have this selected. And I will shrink it down by pressing S. But then if I want to actually shrink it along a particular axis, let's say my blue axis or the Z axis, I just press Z while I'm shrinking it. Now we can see over here in the dimensions on the side that it is shrinking down just the Z axis only. So I'm going to make it till it is about 10 centimeters thick. Not 10 centimeters. Maybe 20. There you go, so 0.2 meters. That's kind of a thick chair. You can just eyeball it. We're not actually doing anything terribly accurate here anyways. We just want it to look like a chair. All right, so now this is flat, like the seat of a chair, and about as wide as a chair. So that's a good start for it. Now, what we need to do then is, oh, I see, I had it in tweak mode. No wonder I was so confused. Okay, so dropping down this menu, clicking and holding it, will allow you to see whether or not you can select things with a circle or a polygon. I had mistakenly changed it into tweak mode. So anyway, here we are with the select box. That's what I want. And I can create a box by selecting around the object to select it. All right, so what we want to do though is that right now we are in object mode, meaning that I am only working with a cube or the lighting or the camera. Those are the objects of my scene. But if I want to actually edit the cube, I press the tab button. And what it does is that it changes this drop-down menu up here from the object mode to the edit mode. So when I press tab, it just keeps on bouncing back and forth between edit and object mode. Once I'm in edit mode, you're going to see that the entire cube is surrounded by pixels, these little dots. Each one of these is called a vertex. And now for those of you who are familiar with geometry, if you've taken it in school, are going to be familiar with how vertexes are referenced. If you've never taken geometry before, though, this is just what's used by mathematicians to describe 3D shapes or even 2D shapes. So a vertex is just a single point that's just floating in space. Each one of these vertexes by themselves don't make anything, but because I have 8 of them and they form a square here, and then another square on bottom, I have this 3D shape that we call a cube. Now, once I'm in edit mode, all the same functions that I have mentioned before will also work. We can click on a vertex, grab it, and drag it all around. Now, of course, this doesn't exactly look like a chair, but you can see that I'm editing my object so it looks a little bit different now. Now, one of the problems is, though, is that for me to make this into a chair with 4 legs on the bottom, I only have 8 vertexes to work with. I can sort of pull them off into points and make each one of these a chair, but that would be a very weird looking chair. So instead, what I need to do is I need to add more of these points, and I do that by subdividing my object. So to subdivide the object, we have to pick every single vertex that's on it. One way I can do that is by clicking and dragging the mouse around it, but the only problem with actually choosing to drag a box around it is that it's only going to choose all the things that you can see, all the things that are visible right now by my editing camera. If I switch over to the back side here, you're going to see that this vertex on the bottom hasn't been selected. Now I could select it now just by pressing Shift and clicking on it, and now my whole object is selected. That's kind of a pain though, so really they make it easy for you. You can actually select a whole object just by pressing the A button. And then you can double tap A to select nothing, or to deselect it. So press A to select everything. And now all of the vertex of my object are selected. So now with the whole thing selected, I can add more vertexes by subdividing them. I can right-click and bring up the right-click menu, and you'll see right up on top here is the option to subdivide. So I can click on that, and now you can see that my object has 4 squares on top, 4 squares on the side, and 4 squares on the bottom. It's basically doubled everything. And down here in the lower left-hand side is my Subdivide menu. So you can see that it says number of cuts, and it's cut it 1 time. I can increase this to 3 cuts, and this is probably going to be good enough to make my chair at this point. So what you can imagine then is each one of these squares, I can pull it down until it actually looks like the leg of a chair. So of course, how do we actually grab one of these squares? Right now, I'm only able to grab just these points, which is kind of cool because now that I've got more of these points here, you can see that when I pull it up, I'm actually having better control how my object looks. But I don't really want to just select a single point. I want to select an entire face, which is the space inside these squares here. I do that by changing it to the face select mode. So in the upper left-hand corner here, I can see that there is the vertex select mode, edge select mode, and face select mode. So with edge select, it'll pick just one of these lines. And in face select mode, I'm picking an entire face. Now, mind you, these are still the exact same terms that they use in mathematics and geometry. So a vertex is referring to a single point, and a face is when you have a shape and the side of that shape. So in this case, I have a square here, and between these 4 vertexes, I have my face. So with face select mode now, I can go around and I can select all of the bottom of this. So let me grab the 4 along the bottom. I do that by pressing the Shift button while I go through and click. The Shift button means that I'm adding to the selection. Likewise, too, I can use the Control button and it'll create a line from the beginning to wherever I clicked to. So that's kind of a handy way to go off and select things. But I'm trying to make the legs of my chair, so I'm just going to use Shift. And with each 4 of these selected, I can now extrude my shapes. So extrusion is actually a manufacturing term that is also being used today in 3D printing. Extrusion basically means that you are adding more material to your object. So when I press E to extrude, I'm literally adding new shapes to the bottom, following along with the 4 faces that I had already selected before. And the handy thing by me selecting them all at the same time is that they are all at the same level too. They're nice and flat and next to each other the way they should be. If I try to, extrude, if I try to do them all one by one, I'd be kind of guessing as to whether or not I actually had them in the right level or not. Which of course doesn't look very chair-like. So you can always be guaranteed that they're always going to be at the same level by just going through, pressing Shift to select them all, press E to extrude them all at the same time. And now we've got the 4 legs. Now, likewise, too, we have this little menu right down here, which we can actually look for more specific details. So, for example, my extrusion went down on the z-axis by 0.49 or so. So you can make it super long if you want or not, or if you want to be really, really exact, you can even say that you want it to be 0.5 meters, a half a meter long. And that's how much we've extruded it by. Pretty handy. So this is already looking pretty chair-like at this point. To make it more like a chair, of course, we want to actually add a back to it. So there's a couple ways we could do that. One way is, of course, I could just go along and select all the ones in the back. Now, of course, this is kind of a pain. I'm trying to select all the ones in the back, but by using the box select tool, it's kind of selecting them all in a zigzag fashion. One way I can select all the ones in the back is by pressing the Control button, as I mentioned before, and I have all the ones in the back selected. Alternatively, I can even look at the top of my object by pressing the number 7 on my number pad. Make sure you're using the number pad and not the numbers along the top of the keyboard. By pressing the 7 on the number pad, it changes me into orthographic mode. And orthographic mode means instead of being a perspective where you can see something going off into the distance, orthographic mode, everything is pressed flat, as though you're looking at it straight on the side. And it's very handy when you want to actually see just a particular edge or a particular side of things. So by pressing the number 7, I've switched it into the top orthographic mode. So looking right up here, up in the corner here in the left-hand corner, it says top orthographic. So I'm looking along the top now, and that means I can actually draw my box around here and select the top of my shape. And then when I rotate around, it switches back into perspective mode, and you can see that I've selected the whole top again. Pretty handy. But I don't necessarily want to do it that way because I can actually see that it looked like it selected too much. Isn't that interesting? It actually kind of selected over the edge. Now that's not necessarily the end of the world. Even if I extrude it from here, it will still go up. But as you can see, if we look really close here, it's actually trying to pull it off of the back as well as the middle, and it's creating a bit of an angle when it does that. Although that is kind of a cool effect, actually. Now it's like a reclining back chair. I might even want to leave it like that. So I'd say probably best practice here, use the Control button. Then it'll only select the ones on top. And now we have a solid backed chair. That's actually a pretty good chair. But I want to give it a little bit more detail here. So instead of doing it that way, let's try this instead. We're going to go off and click on the left side, press Shift, and select the right side. Now when I extrude it up, you see that I have 2 sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag it up and click. In this point, the left click means that I'm just dropping it where I left it off. That's a good place for it to be because this is actually just going to be the bottom half of my chair. Now I can press E to extrude again, and when you see that you're extruding again, there is a whole new series of vertexes and edges that have been added along there. So I'm going to click right here, just going to make it a little bit shorter than the rest, and you'll see why in a moment. So what we want to do now is I'm going to pick the inside square, rotate around the view till I can see the other side, press Shift and click. So now the 2 sides that are facing each other have been selected. Now this is one of the really cool functions that is built into Blender. When you right-click and go down your menu here, you're going to see that a new option has appeared that says Bridge Faces. When you click on Bridge Faces, it literally just draws a bridge between the 2 faces and merges them together. So this is kind of cool. Now I've actually got a back of my chair in a way that's kind of more like a traditional chair. And you can see too that your bridge has a whole lot of extra functions added to it, such as twisting it and the like. I don't want to twist it because it's going to make my chair looking weird, but hey, this is your 3D animation. Go ahead and explore some of these extra things. We can add extra cuts to it. So as you can see, each cut adds an extra line to it. And then as I twist it, there we go. It creates kind of a cool twisting effect. So definitely, when you want to add more detail like that, always add more cuts. But like I said, mine, I want to keep it simple. So I'm going to just say 0 twists and 0 cuts. There we go. Nice, solid line. Very neat. Easy to work with. All right, so let's keep on making this chair a little bit taller. We're going to select the 2 top faces on each side again. Extrude them again. Left click to drop them down again. Extrude them up to make a little square up on top. And then the same thing as before. The 2 inside faces facing each other. Right click. Bridge faces. Now this is a pretty good chair. Looks quite traditional. Now a couple of things we can point out before we go on to our next object here. We can then click on the square on the top left and the top right. Left click again, and you're going to see one of the options is poke faces. Poking basically just means that we create an X along the top. Pretty cool. So basically when you poke something, it finds every single vertex nearby, and then it cuts through the face, making a vertex along each individual point. So I like adding this to it because then I can pretend that my chair is like a throne. I can switch it back into vertex mode here. Pick the point on top, shift click, and pick the point on the other top. Now I can grab them and pull them up. And now it looks like a throne. To make sure that it doesn't zigzag back and forth, I'm going to press the Z button to lock it into the Z axis. Now they're both going nice and straight up next to each other. There we go. I've got a throne. It's got points on the back. Pretty cool. So here's my chair, or my throne, with points on the back. Feel free, of course, to explore your own things and include your own pokes. But for now, we are done with this object. So press the Tab button. We go back into object mode, and you'll see that all of my vertexes and my edges and my faces are hidden now. And instead, it's just the object itself. I can go into the upper right-hand corner here where it says Cube and double-click on it to give it a new name. I'm going to call this a chair now. So now that I have my chair there and pressing the numpad to zoom back in, where did I go? Where did my chair go? What did I do? Oh, I must have accidentally deleted it. How silly is that? All right, so double-click, rename it to chair, C-H-A-I-R. You can also right-click on it and say rename. I believe that's one of the options here. It's actually not one of the options. I thought it would be. Too bad. All right, so you can double-click on it to change its name, or the F2 key on your keyboard will also rename it. And mind you, F2 works in any Windows program. I'm not sure about Macs offhand, but if you ever need to rename a file or something like that, F2 is the number that you press to rename things. And that works for my chair as well. So great, now I have my chair. I'm in object mode, so I can actually just grab my chair and push it aside for now. I'm going to keep it on the X-axis just so I'm not wobbling all over the place. And my chair is now pushed to the side, and I can add in a new object now. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is this little dotted circle in the middle of my world right now. That is my cursor. And when I switch into cursor move mode over on the side, the left-hand side over here, you can see that you can actually move that cursor around. So wherever this cursor is, this is actually going to be wherever we place new objects. Traditionally, of course, the cursor starts in the middle of the world. But you can often move it around to any other location. Likewise, too, if I remember correctly, you can even change where the cursor is located, I think by pressing Shift-C. Yeah, there we are. So Shift-C will always bring your cursor back to the beginning of the world again. Pretty handy like that. Okay. Someone says they can't see my screen. Let's see here. Zooming in. Looks like it's showing up in Facebook, so hopefully you can see the screen again. Just send me a text if you can see it. Okay, you can see the screen now. Excellent. So, okay, with my cursor in the middle of the world, I'm going to go up to the Add button. And you can see that there's a whole lot of different objects that we can add to the world. Cameras, lighting, so on. What we want to use instead is a mesh. So for those of you who took my game design class, you're going to remember that meshes are a way for a computer to quickly and easily store a three-dimensional object in its memory. So meshes are basically any three-dimensional object. We have a bunch of three-dimensional objects we can pick from here, such as just a simple plane, which is just a flat square. Or we can even add in UV spheres. And a UV sphere is a sphere with square sides, kind of like a globe. Very handy for projecting images onto a sphere. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in the next class. But for now, at least, we don't need to worry about a UV sphere. And then there's also the icosphere, or excuse me, the isosphere, standing for isosahedron. Oh, wait, where am I? Here we are. Add mesh isosphere, which uses triangles around the sphere. Okay, so the next object we're going to make, however, is a table. So let's go to Add a new mesh, and we're just going to be adding a new cube. Now with this new cube here, you're going to see over here on the side that you can change its size and rotation and location. In this case, I think I'm actually going to leave it as a 2-meter wide cube because it's going to be kind of a longer table. We're going to stretch it out again. We're going to shrink it by pressing the S button again and pressing Z to lock it down on the Z axis till it's fairly thin like a table. And then I'm going to say stretch it along the Y axis to make it narrow. So it will be about 1 meter wide along the long edge and 2 meters wide, excuse me, 2 meters wide along the long edge and 1 meter wide along the short edge, and about 10 centimeters along the Z-axis. So it's kind of like a table now. Same thing as before. If we want to add legs to it, we press Tab. Then we subdivide it. Now, of course, there is a subdivide button over here on the side over here. Of course, I don't use it that often, so I don't remember offhand which one it is. But as you go along here, you can see that it actually gives you different things to choose. Actually, subdivide apparently is not an option. And I thought it was. All right, so then subdivide then is only going to be done by right-clicking, making sure you have everything selected by pressing the A button. Click Subdivide, which again gives us a series of these. I can even say subdivide again, or I could even just say subdivide, use the menu down here, and subdivide it a bunch of times. 6 or 7 times? I say 7 times. Yeah, okay. I think that's good enough. Maybe 6 times. I want to kind of make the table a little bit more rounded than I made the chair. So I want to make sure I have a lot of these extra sides, but enough of them too that I can actually kind of make them more rounded as I work on it. So now that I have these 7 here, what I can do then is I can look at the bottom side here. And I want to just select all of the vertexes along the outside edge here. This might actually be a good opportunity to use the face select actually. So if I look at the bottom here, select the whole thing, it's kind of selected the edges. I should probably use vertex mode, not vertex mode, orthographic mode to make sure I get a good clean shot on the bottom here. So I press 7 to look at the top and then 9 to look at the opposite side. So if I'm looking at one side, I press 9 to look at the other side, which in this case is the bottom. So here we are. Now I'm going to select the whole thing. Oops, here we are. Select the whole thing. Rotate around, and now it's actually selected the inside edge. That's actually what I want in this case. Now, Of course, I was forgetting by pressing 7 and 9, the other thing I should mention is that when you select along the outside, it's selecting everything, including the outside. But the way the box select works is that it's greedy. I can actually select all of these cubes by selecting along the inside. And as you can see, as long as my box selection is touching it, it will select it. But now, instead of selecting the outside edge, you can see that it's only selecting the bottom ones. But again, I think I actually want to select the outside edge as well. So I'm just going to select the whole thing. It's going to spill over a little bit, but that's what I want. And now that I have that whole thing selected, I'm going to shrink it just a tad. Just a little bit. So now we have this cool effect where it kind of looks like it's actually sloping in a little bit to the bottom side. Now, one more thing we can do, I'm going to teach you guys about as well today, is how to select an entire ring around an object. So for example, if I press the Alt button and click on this line right between these two edges here, between these two faces, this edge right here, it's going to select a ring all the way around the object. So this is what's called loop select. So when I press loop select and I pick a particular edge, it's going to try and create a loop all the way around, finding all of the related edges to that loop. And it is a very handy way to get a loop all the way around it. You're going to see that when you press the Alt button too, down here in the lower left-hand corner, it actually says loop select. So you can see that it's actually changing how my select is working by pressing Alt. So with the Alt key selected, I'm just going to pick the bottom edge here. Now I'm going to shrink this one in as well. So now I've got this really cool tiered effect going on here on my table. Very cool. And you can keep on doing that with all of them. I mean, for example, I could even create a loop around this, press S for the size, and shrink that in as well. That's kind of weird looking. If you want to make your table really fancy, you can do it that way. But for now, I'm just going to make mine fancy by creating this kind of tiered effect. All right, now we press 7 to look at the top, 9 to look at the bottom again. And we're going to select the 4 corners, same way as before. Rotate the view till it's on its side, press E to extend it down, and we've got 4 legs. Same thing as before, you're going to want to make sure that it's probably 0.5 meters because we want the chair to fit underneath it. Actually slightly more than 0.5 meters. Oh yes, and if you see it zigzagging like this while you bring it down, remember, press Z to lock it into the Z axis. There we go. Now it's a little bit longer. The chair should fit underneath it. Great. So I can grab it, press Z again. Or I can even click E, drag it down, left click, and then use the actual extrude menu here to make sure that it is exactly 0.6 meters. So my chair can fit underneath it. So that's kind of cool. And then the next thing we can do then is we can make the chair legs have slightly rounded bottoms. We do that by adding an inset. The inset can be brought with the letter I. And I believe, yes, here we are. Inset is also included right here over on the side. It does the same thing. So by pressing inset, it creates a new face inside the face that you're working on and drags them all together. So you can see now that I've got like these little X's going into my new cubes. With these new shapes, I can now grab it, but not with the letter H. I didn't mean to do H. All right, let's try this again. I for inset, G for grab, and now you can see they kind of create these little points that go down. Press Z to lock it in again. And as you can see now, they appear to be rounded edges on the bottom. Great. I've got a chair and a table. Let's see if we can make another object. Press Tab to switch it back into object mode. Grab the table, push it along the x-axis till the chair is right next to it. I'm going to have to drag it up a little bit so the chair can actually be underneath it. There we go. Good enough. Okay, so now we are going to add a vase. To add the vase, we're going to be needing to add a more spherical object this time. So this is a good opportunity for us to use one of our spheres, or maybe our cylinder. I think the cylinder might actually be easier in this situation. So for those of you who've taken geometry before or might remember from your first grade classes, a cylinder is a round object with circles on one end. It's like a square down the middle, and then a circle on the other end. Now when you're creating a cylinder using Blender, it gives you a bunch of choices here to decide how big it is. Now of course I don't want my vase to be a meter radius, so a radius being the distance from the center to the edge. And I don't want it to have the depth of 2. This would be a huge vase. Actually, that would be very cool, but no, I don't want to do it that way. So instead, I want my vase to be 0.2 radius, 0.2 depth. No, not 0.2 depth. We'll make it 0.5 depth. There we are. And this can be our vase that we're working on. So right now, of course, it doesn't really have much of a shape that's at all useful to us. So we need to go in and start editing it again. One thing before I go into edit mode is to look at the rest of this cylinder menu here. Is the cap fill type right now is set to noon, meaning it is a solid circle. One of the other options is triangle fan, meaning that each vertex creates a triangle all going in towards the center of it. For the purposes of our vase, I'm going to use the noon view. But I, of course, could even say nothing, and it'll be totally hollow right through the middle, too. But I'm going to use the noon view for now. So now when I switch into my edit mode, you're going to see that I have a whole bunch of faces along the side here and a single solid face on top. This is the noon cap type. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go off and start adding some extra lines along the side so I can shape this out. Now, of course, you might say, well, let's use subdivision again like we did before. But maybe subdivision isn't really going to quite work in this case. It's starting to create too many lines, and it's making it a little bit confusing for me to work with. So instead of the subdivision, there is the loop cut. The loop cut is an option that's over here on the side, or you can press Control R. And when you add in a loop cut, it's going to want to know how many times you want to cut on an object. So I can use the mouse button to choose how many extra cuts I want. For my vase here, I'm going to add, say, 5 of them, and I'm going to click with the left mouse button. The next thing it's going to want you to do is to say where you want to place these loop cuts. I want my loop cuts to be totally in the center, so I'm going to right-click, which basically just means cancel, drop it right down, right in the middle where we left it off. So this is kind of like making a subdivision, but only along the cuts that I added. This is my loop cut. So now we can actually choose the number of cuts, and there's a bunch of other functions that we can choose. Nothing terribly that we really need to worry about right now. This is good enough. All right, so now we can push it into edge mode, which is the middle button in the upper left-hand corner right here. And same thing as before, by pressing the Alt button and selecting it, it selects the whole ring around the middle. So let's make this look more like a vase. I can scale this in. Press Alt, select the next one, scale that in. Press Alt, select that, scale that in. And press Alt, select the bottom one, and scale that in. And we can just keep on adjusting this until it actually looks a lot more vase-like. And if for some reason you're not satisfied and you think that you need to have more cuts, well, just remember you press Control R and it will add in another loop cut. Be aware, of course, of which section you're hovering it over, though. As you can see, if I get up to one of these other lines here, it's going to make my loop cut up through the top. So I can just click, put in a lunar loop cut, and now I can scale this one. Likewise true, you could also start using extrusion again. I can switch this into face select mode, press E to extrude, and it's almost like I have a whole nother loop cut added to the bottom. Scale this in. Scale that in. Oh, let's go back to edge select mode. Scale that in. And of course, you can even grab these groups, but just make sure, of course, that if you don't want to be going side to side and doing weird things, press Z to lock it into the Z axis, and you can grab that whole ring and drag it up. So that's a pretty cool looking vase. Now, of course, it's got a totally solid top because of the noon cap type. So this is actually a handy situation where we can use inset again. By pressing I and creating an inset, it creates an inner ring. And then I can grab this, lock it into the Z until it creates a little bit of a sharp lip there. And then press E to extrude, but instead of extruding up this time and creating new stuff, I can actually extrude in and push it straight down. Now the only problem is this is actually looking like it's making some new stuff there and overlapping, which is going to get weird. So let's scale this in a little bit more so we can actually just go straight through the middle of the vase. Extrude. All the way down. I don't think this really needs to go all the way to the bottom of the vase because really no one's actually going to see through to the bottom of the vase. We just want them to actually see along the top here. So that way we can actually see how that vase looks like it has an opening, even if it's not completely accurate on the inside. Now, one thing, of course, you might be wondering is how can I actually see what's going on in the inside? Well, one way to do that is to switch into wireframe mode by pressing Shift-Z, or just by pressing the Z button and switching into either wireframe mode or solid mode. You'll also see that there's rendered and material preview here. We'll go into that a little bit next week. So solid mode just makes it look like it's a totally solid object. By pressing Shift-Z, it's wireframe mode, which means I only see the edges and the vertexes, not the faces. So this is a kind of handy way now. Let's say I want to look at it straight on the side using orthographic mode, so I press the 1 button. So now this is the front view. I can grab the inside, lock it in with the Z button, and push it all the way down until I see that it is nearly at the bottom. Now, of course, when you're in wireframe mode too, this is also how you can actually select an entire object, because now that you can see through it, you can actually select everything too. So now you can see that my object is selected both on the inside and on the outside because I'm using the wireframe mode. Pretty handy. Okay, so I've got my inside, I've got my outside. This is a pretty cool looking vase. Let's press Tab, grab it, drag it on top of my table here. It's kind of floating off in the distance, but we can worry about that later. I'm going to zoom in on it here, grab it along the Z-axis. And now by pressing 1 and 3, I see that it's kind of floating in the midair, so we'll just bring it right down till it's sitting on top of my table. There we go, a table, a chair, and a vase. Okay, in the remaining time that we have here, I am going a little bit over just to make up for the time where we lost because of the mechanical failure, the microphone failure. I'm going to see if I can add in a person, and then we'll start trying to see if we can actually decorate these things next week by adding on materials and textures onto them. So again, looking over here at my cursor, I want the cursor to go back to the center again. So, where did the cursor go? There we go. Press Shift-C, cursor's back in the middle again. Excellent, that's what I wanted. So to create my person, I'm going to create a sort of blockhead style person. Kind of like the blockhead style person that you see in the video game Minecraft. This is a pretty simple shape to make. Of course, you can add more detail yourself, and I'll show you ways that you can add more detail. But again, just for keeping this class simple so we can get straight to animating things, I'm just going to make a blockhead style person. So again, to make a blockhead, we will add in a cube. Now again, this is a pretty large cube, so let's just make it a meter wide. This is going to be the torso of our person. Let's switch it into edit mode here. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch it into face select mode. And now I'm going to make the neck. Now, one way to make the neck, you can probably imagine, is to make an inset and extrude it up. Alternatively, too, when you extrude new objects, you can right-click on an object, which means you're canceling the extrusion and just leaving it flat against the original face that we were extruding it off of. But the thing is, it's actually still there. So I can actually grab this extrusion now, and you can see that it is getting pulled up. So with my extrusion still there, because I right-clicked on it, I can scale this in, and as you can see, it's made an inset again. The exact same process of making an inset. I extruded, but I canceled, leaving the extrusion flat against the other face. Then I scaled it down in, and it's just like making an inset. So let's scale this in a little bit more. This will be the neck. Extrude it up. Now we extrude it up again. This will be the head. But again, I'm going to right-click on it, scale it out, and then grab it up. Oh, wait, no, I mean extrude it up. There we go. So now we've got a head, a neck. We can even add in shoulders if you want. We can make this point where it goes between the neck and the torso a little bit more sloped. We can do that by grabbing onto one edge on one side, one edge on the other. Grabbing them up along the z-axis, and they go up side by side. And it's a little bit more rounded. That's kind of cool. It's like a person now. So we got the head, neck, and shoulders. To add in the arms, let's go back to face select mode. Select the face on one side. Select the face on the other side by pressing Shift and click. We right click, and this time we will use subdivide. So I'm going to subdivide it 3 times, I guess. And now with the arms on one side, I'm going to select them in the middle here. Select these squares on the middle on this side. So I got this both squares selected on each side. I'm going to press 1 to look at it in the front view. Now I extrude it again. Now by extruding it like this, it's thinking I'm wanting it to go up and down, which I definitely don't want. So again, I'm going to just drop the extrusion by right-clicking. And now I'm going to scale my extrusion out. Now, of course, because I'm scaling it, it is making it wider and wider and kind of giving me angel wings. So instead, I'm going to press the X button. So it's only scaling it out along the X-axis. So instead of my outer squares getting wider and wider, they're going to remain the same size. I'm just stretching out the whole extrusion that I made. Now, one thing to keep in mind, usually speaking on human beings, arms are usually long enough to go down just slightly past the hip. So if you imagine where your hands go when you're just standing with your hands by your side, you can think of actually like the top of the heel of your palm actually can sit on your hip bone while your hands actually extend a little bit below that, I think. Pretty close anyway. So keep that in mind when you make your arms. Of course, you can make them super silly if you want, but we're not making that sort of an animation. So here we are with our arms sticking out here on the side. This is actually fine. Now, in 3D animation, all the 3D animated models will always have their arms sticking out on the sides. You can actually see this even if you go to, for example, behind-the-scenes videos of Disney movies and the like. You will always see that the models, whether we're talking about the famous models from all the famous Disney movies, are always going to be having their arms sticking out on the side. So we're doing the same thing here. This is a particularly handy way to figure out how you're going to design your model of a person, because you want to make sure that you can see all of the clothing and everything that might be sitting on it. Now, having the arms out on the side is a very convenient way to do that. Once we start animating it, of course, we're going to be pulling the arms down. So that way we can have better control and make it look more realistic, like a person walking. We can even add in elbows, for example. So instead of actually having this extrusion go so far out, I can actually stop about halfway through and extrude it again, right-click to drop it down, scale it along the x-axis. So each one of these seams here, each one of these edges can be like the elbow that we're working with. All right, now we go down and we look at the bottom here. And we're going to want to take this and subdivide it a few more times. And by pressing 7 to look at the top and 9 to look at the bottom, we're going to change these whole sections into the 2 legs. First things first, let's just add in a belt so that our person doesn't look completely fat. We're going to extrude that down a little bit and just tuck it in, adjust it a little bit. Make a belt. And then this is where the legs are actually going to begin. To make sure that we measure out our legs correctly, we're going to say 7 and 9 again. And I'm just going to select all of these faces along the side here. Extrude it down. Oops, but I got to pull it back up again. All right, here we are. Extrude it down. And I can actually type in a number to make sure that it's the exact number that I want. This is how I'm going to make sure that the legs are both the same height. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there is the number of the distance of how long it is. So let's say we're going to make it, I don't know, 1.5. Yeah, that looks all right. So 7 and 9, I'm going to select the other side now. Looking really close. And extrude this one down too. Now make sure, of course, you don't extrude the left and the right legs simultaneously or else they'll be attached to each other. We don't want them to be attached to each other. We want them to actually be separate. So that's why we're extruding these down separately. So I'm going to extrude this again, say 1.5. You can see that it is exactly the right height I want it to be. They're both exactly the same. And this is my basic person here. I think my arms are actually pretty huge, all things considered, so maybe I'm going to want to just shrink them down a little bit. I could even maybe just shrink them down along the elbow here. That might even work. Alt-Shift-Click to select them all together. Pull it in. Scale it along the x-axis. Yeah, there we go. Maybe? Maybe not. Same thing over on this side. Let's take these ones. And to make sure that we're scaling it to the exact same size on both sides, I'm going to select them both. Scale it down again, but this time along the z-axis. Scale it down again along the y-axis. Yeah, okay, that works. Still think maybe the arms are just too long. I think I made gorilla arms here. Much too long. So Alt and click to select one loop edge. Alt and click to select the other. Scale along the x-axis. Now the elbows are in the middle mostly. Close enough. Okay, so switching back to object mode, I can see now, of course, I still made this person too big compared to the size of my table. According to this, it's actually 4 meters tall, so I'm just going to shrink the whole thing down a little bit till he's just 2 meters tall. Now he's like a standard human size. A fairly tall human, but close enough. All right, so this concludes this class. So sorry, at least, for all the trouble at the beginning of the class with the microphone. I'll have to either get a new microphone or try and fix it before next week. This was the class on 3D modeling and animation. Next week, we're going to be learning about how to add materials to our objects to make it so that way our vase is painted, our person maybe has a face and clothing, our table and chair look like they're made out of wood. And if there's even more time too, I'll also show you how we can even include an egg so we can perhaps even make our own silly egg dog video, just for fun. So anyways, I hope you guys had fun tonight, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you all very much.